Hot. It's 5:05 and welcome into a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We start this morning with an update for the Supreme Court, the race that is still yet to be certified by the North Carolina State Board of Elections. We talked about the legal action last week, and we did get an update late in the day on Friday. Republican State Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin filed a motion, as he was requested to by the judge, on Friday evening, asking federal judge Richard Myers to send the legal dispute with the North Carolina State Board of Elections back to state court. Griffin is also seeking an injunction blocking the election board from certifying the election results of the November the 5th Supreme Court election. Without court action, the state board is likely to certify appointed incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs as the election winner as early as the end of this week, potentially January 10th. That's this Friday. Riggs currently leads Griffin by 734 votes out of 5.5 million ballots that were cast in that election that, again, took place back in early November. Griffin is challenging more than 60,000 ballots statewide in that race. Certification of the election would essentially moot Griffin's legal challenge. In the paperwork filed by Griffin back on December the 18th, he asked the highest court in the state, the North Carolina Supreme Court, to address his dispute with the election board. The board filed paperwork the following day that being the State Board of Election, filed paperwork the following day to remove the case to the U.S. District Court under Chief District Judge Richard Myers. In Griffin's most recent and up-to-date legal challenge on Friday, his lawyers wrote, "At the bottom, the board's attempt to remove threatens our system of federalism. This case primarily turns upon unsettled issues of state election law, and states, not the federal government, have the primary responsibility to regulate elections for state offices. But the board has attempted to circumvent a decision by the state's highest court by injecting a slew of inapplicable federal defenses and meritless arguments about their application solely for the purpose of obtaining federal jurisdiction. If this court maintains jurisdiction here, that decision will only incentivize the board to repeat these tactics in the future." As Myers considers whether to keep the case or maintain jurisdiction, Griffin also asked the judge on Friday to issue an injunction, which his lawyers claim, quote, is warranted to maintain the status quo until the appropriate court can decide this case on its merits. Myers set a Friday deadline for Griffin to reply to arguments that were put forward earlier in the week, the first day of the new year, on Wednesday by the election board, Allison Riggs, and activists working with Democrat operative Mark Elias's law firm. The judge specifically ordered state election officials to show cause as to why the case should not return to state court. Griffin, who is a current state court of appeals judge, is the petitioner in that case. And when you hear me refer to petitioner, they are referring to Griffin. In this lawsuit, petitioner makes an astonishing request to change long-standing election rules after an election has already taken place, and by doing so, disenfranchise more than 60,000 voters who followed the rules in place at the time of the election. That's according to the State Board of Election lawyers in a lawsuit, or rather an update that they wrote on Wednesday of last week. They said the request relief confers jurisdiction on the court several times over. They also said it squarely raises substantial federal questions under the U.S. Constitution, the Help America Vote Act, and other federal statutes. Indeed, petitioner, or Griffin, himself asks for a judicial decree that has requested relief does not violate these statutes or the U.S. Constitution. Given this request, it is hard to envision a lawsuit that more squarely implicates federal law. The election board lawyers argued federal jurisdiction is also proper because granting petitioners' request relief would require the State Board of Elections to violate federal civil rights laws. Among other things, the petitioner seeks relief that would violate the National Voter Registration Act's limits on how states may remove voters from the rolls. The election board has urged a U.S. District Judge and Richard Myers to keep the case or exercise jurisdiction, then deny Griffin's requested injunction. Allison Riggs, the now individual who is currently on the court, is up about 734 votes, argued in a separate briefing on Wednesday. Judge Griffin cannot show that he is likely to succeed in throwing out tens of thousands of votes cast by fellow North Carolinians in compliance with official guidance. And the public interest does not favor runner-up candidates who seek to undo the will of voters. On Tuesday, a couple of former Democratic congressional leaders led a group of 7 congressmen urging Myers to reject Griffin's request to send the case back to state court. Griffin's lawyers wrote in support of their motion for the injunction, "Without a preliminary injunction, mootness will deprive the court of jurisdiction to consider any issues that are presented in this matter. A preliminary injunction would simply stay the board's hand. The board will not be harmed by that injunction, and indeed, North Carolina law contemplates delays in election certification while judicial review is pending." By contrast, the court filing says, by contrast, Judge Griffin will be irreparably harmed absent this injunction. His protests will be mooted and he will lose the election. And preventing the board's certification from mooting Judge Griffin's challenge to unlawful ballots will serve the important public interest in election integrity as well as franchisement. Myers issued a December the 20th order denying Judge Griffin's request for a temporary restraining order in the case. That same U.S. District Judge is overseeing a lawsuit that the North Carolina Democrat Party filed. That was back on December 6th, dealing with the same ballot challenges that Griffin addresses in his complaint. Griffin's complaint highlighted 3 categories of election protest. 1, voters who registered without providing a driver's license number or the last 4 digits of their social security number. 2, voters who have never lived in North Carolina. And 3, overseas voters who did not provide photo identification. Those are the 3 claims, the 3 issues that Judge Griffin has. Looking at the court filing, it says, in response to these protests, the state board and the opposing candidate, Justice Allison Riggs, have claimed that Judge Griffin is seeking to retroactively change election law. That flatly mischaracterizes the timeline. The court filing went on to say our registration statuses have required driver's license or social security numbers back to 2004. That's from HAVA, the federal law. Our state constitution has imposed a residency requirement since 1776, and photo identification has been required for absentee voting since at least 2018. The laws that should have governed this election were therefore established long before. The state board simply chose to break the law. End quote. That's from Griffin's attorneys. So we will likely get some more movement on this week from a U.S. District Judge Richard Myers. If nothing happens within the next couple of days, the North Carolina State Board of Elections is likely to certify Allison Riggs as the winner in this U.S. Supreme Court race as early as Friday of this week. That's January the 10th. We will be keeping a very close eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get an update on traffic this morning with Dave Hewitt.
Hey, we're in...
It's 5:19. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Don't forget, if you miss any portion of the show, you can download the podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour in your favorite podcast app. Tap the subscribe and follow button, and you'll get a new show delivered to your smartphone each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. We are also streaming live this morning, as we are each and every morning, on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Well, a major storm system continues to push its way across the mid-Atlantic this morning, bringing winter precipitation out in the western half of the state, rain showers through the Charlotte metro, and it will continue its way east throughout the day today. Of course, that is relevant with expected snow, ice, and rain out in the western half of our state. We're talking about counties like Caldwell, Avery, Watauga, Ashe, individuals that were so greatly impacted by the impacts of Hurricane Helene. Recovery and relief efforts are still ongoing. As we talk this morning, you have individuals that are still struggling in regards to getting into their property. Temporary structures are still being deployed. Folks living in tents. A rough situation continues out west. Of course, we are now very square in the winter season, and that recovery and relief does continue out in western North Carolina as of this morning, with some icy and windy, rainy, snowy types of participation out in the western half of North Carolina. We'll keep an eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:21. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Just 6 days into the new year, and we are already looking ahead to midterm elections in 2026. To get some more details on a very pivotal race that will be taking place here in North Carolina, David Larson from the CarolinaJournal.com joins us this morning. U.S. Senator Thom Tillis, David, is going to have a lot on his plate over the next, let's call it 16 to 18 months as we approach the elections in 2026. You've got an opinion piece out this morning. What are the details that you're looking at there?
Yeah, so as I was saying, that a lot of people are just happy that the elections are over and they get to be with their family over the holidays. But people like you and I, who have to look at the news all the time, or who are really interested in that, are starting to look toward 2026. And I think probably North Carolina, the biggest race we're going to be looking at, obviously, is that 2026 U.S. Senate race. And often an incumbent has an easier time getting through, but Thom Tillis is seeing a little bit of trouble. He might have a couple of hurdles, both in the primary and the general. So first off, with the primary, there's been a little, he was censured by the North Carolina GOP in 2023 last year, or I guess, it's 2025 now, so that's not last year anymore, but recently. And that had to do with, he had worked together on something regarding codifying same-sex marriage. So that was a controversy with some people in the base. And then also some people in the base thought, he was behind the scenes, not being helpful to people like Madison Cawthorn or Mark Robinson to help them, more conservative grassroots people win their elections. So there's a little bit of a grassroots rebellion against him, I'd say. So some evidence of that is you had a poll by Victory Insights, I believe. They had 800 likely voters in North Carolina, GOP primary voters, and 65% favored Laura Trump over, and then 11% favored Thom Tillis. So I don't know, if those numbers would hold up, but I mean, something like, or someone like a Laura Trump, who has that Trump name to them and is a very young and exciting candidate, that could pose a problem for him. But that would, that would just come down to whether she decides to run. And, a lot of it also come down to whether Trump, her father-in-law, Donald Trump, would put his thumb on the scales too. Because I don't know, he might end up thinking better to leave well enough alone and try to quash any problems people have with Tillis, and just, we got to go with the candidate we got. So, like I said, a lot of it comes down to how Trump will weigh in on this, and whether. So that's kind of looking at the primary.
Well, yes, and you note that from the primary side, Lara Trump, not currently a resident of the state. We should know sometime by about the summer of this year whether or not that looks probable. She would have to move back to the state and establish residency to run in a March primary. But David, I think the real question that everybody's asking is who would be his Democrat opponent? And the most likely candidate, at least that's been thrown around thus far, is now the former governor of the state of North Carolina, and Roy Cooper, who, regardless of what people want to say, he is a very popular candidate, obviously on the Democrat side, but has got pretty broad bipartisan support.
Yeah, I mean, it surprised a lot of people, who don't know North Carolina politics well to see that we have so many ticket splitters. It's not a new thing. We've had that in North Carolina for a long time, but people voted for Donald Trump and for Roy Cooper. So somehow he's been able to win now 6 straight statewide elections. He had 4 as attorney general, and then 2 as governor. So he is been able to put together 6 big wins across the state. So I think if Democrats had their druthers, they would definitely pick Roy Cooper. He said in his farewell address that he's not done yet. I believe that was earlier this week. He said that, and New York Times followed up with him and asked him, "Does that mean you're going to, run for this U.S. Senate seat?" And he said that he's open to it, and he's going to take some time over the next 2-3 months with his family and thinking about it, talking to them, and then make a decision. But obviously, Democrats, if they had Roy Cooper in that spot to run against Thom Tillis, they'd have probably a pretty good shot at at the race, especially if there's kind of a messy primary on the Republican side. If Tillis kind of squeaks through that, he would have to kind of pull everybody back together to be somebody of the caliber of or with a past history of success, whether we like it or not as conservatives, of a Roy Cooper.
Well, and it's also, I guess, important to note that the 2026 election will be a midterm, and typically in midterms, it is kind of a rebuttal against the party that is in charge. And for the next 2 years, that will be Trump in the White House, Republicans controlling the House by about a 1 or 2 vote margin, and a much larger margin in the Senate. So it seems like, regardless of whether Tillis is the prime candidate or not, he is going to be dealing with an uphill battle just based on historical trends and how midterm elections go for that party that's in charge.
Also, the map doesn't look it doesn't have a lot of opportunities for Democrats. So if you look at it, there's Maine is the only state where there's a Republican, Susan Collins, in the state, holding that seat in a state that was won by Kamala Harris. All the other states, Democrats would have to try to take out a sitting Republican who's in a Republican state, a state won by Trump. So that's a much harder hill to climb. But their best opportunity, as I've seen, many analysts say, outside of Maine, is North Carolina, because after that they're looking at places like, Iowa and Texas that are kind of long shots, whereas North Carolina is, as Josh Stein and Roy Cooper, people like that, they can win statewide races in North Carolina. So that means Democrats are going to pour the money in to Maine and North Carolina, especially. And they might, looking at the map, they might end up just trying to stop the bleeding, because they're going to be more on the defense, because there's states like Georgia and Michigan that were won by Trump that have Democrat senators. So they may end up having to spend more of their money. Even places like Minnesota or New Hampshire that are kind of light blue, depending on the mood of the voters, could require some resources from them, and definitely Michigan and Georgia. So see North Carolina as one of the Democrats nationally, one of their 4 main places to dump money for sure, especially if they have a Roy Cooper, somebody that they believe has a really good shot at that. We can look to them to be putting lots of resources into that race.
There's going to be a lot to follow on that. We'll keep an eye on it. David, where can folks read your opinion piece this morning?
It is on carolinajournal.com. And if you want to see all the opinion pieces, we have a section for opinion. And we also always have new news pieces coming up as well. So,
David Larson joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 529, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Some wet roadways this morning. Let's get an update on traffic with Dave Hewitt.
Yeah, indeed. Wet roads.
It's 5:37. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Monday morning to you. Well, it was a busy day in Washington, D.C. on Friday as Republicans, after a bit of back and forth, did select once again to vote on House Speaker Mike Johnson and continue to give him the gavel up in Washington, D.C. And Congress does prepare to usher in the new Trump administration and era this morning. With that are 5 new members representing North Carolina in the U.S. House of Representatives. And with them, 5 of them were sworn in on Friday. They include Representatives Addison McDowell out of the 6th Congressional District here in North Carolina, Mark Harris out of NC 8, Pat Harrigan out of NC 10, Brad Knott out of NC 13, and the former Speaker of the North Carolina House, and Tim Moore out of North Carolina's 14th Congressional District. In a joint session today, Congress is set to count the Electoral College votes and certify the November 2024 election, with Vice President Kamala Harris presiding over that. Obviously, Trump very successful in winning the Electoral College back in November, 312 to 226. He also won the popular vote by more than 1.5 points. And in North Carolina's 14th Congressional District, Tim Moore was endorsed by Trump, having served as the North Carolina House of Representatives Speaker for almost a decade here before running for Congress. According to NC GOP Chairman Jason Simmons, he says, quote, "We couldn't be prouder of the 5 new members of Congress that North Carolina Republicans are sending to Washington, D.C. We know each of them will serve with distinction and honor to get our economy back on track, secure the southern border, and make America safe once again. North Carolina Republicans will play an integral role in enacting the agenda of President Trump and Vice President Vance, and we are excited to see them get working for our country." As I mentioned, Mike Johnson was reelected the Speaker of the House for the Republicans, and for the Democratic caucus, it will continue with Representative Hakeem Jeffries out of New York. He received 215 votes, all of the Democrats voting in favor of him. With that, Johnson said, "It is now my responsibility to present the gavel to the gentleman from the great state of Louisiana." That was what Speaker Mike Johnson had to say on the House floor on Friday. With that, Representative Richard Hudson also expressed his comments in regards to the re-election of Johnson. He said, "On Election Day, the American people have delivered a resounding mandate to get our country back on track. I am proud to support Mike Johnson because he is a good man, a strong conservative, and has been an outstanding Speaker of the House. He will serve with unwavering faith, integrity, and respect for this institution. I know Mike is the proven, principled leader that we need to help us advance President Donald Trump's agenda and fulfill the promises we made to the American people. With Speaker Johnson at the helm, I'm confident our House Republican majority will deliver. Let's get to work." U.S. Senate also swore in 32 U.S. senators yesterday, or on Friday, rather, for a 6-year term. North Carolina Senators Thom Tillis and Ted Budd, both Republicans, were not sworn in, as they are not up for re-election. That's Tillis until 2026. Budd wrote in the statement on social media, "I am excited to continue my work on behalf of North Carolina on the Senate Armed Services Group, Commerce and Small Business Committees, and my service on the Joint Economic Committee that will focus on creating prosperity for North Carolina and the entire nation. These committee assignments offer a major opportunity to make life better for citizens of North Carolina, and I can't wait to get to work." Those comments coming in from U.S. Senator Ted Budd. There will be more on that throughout the day today. You can read more on our website, carolinajournal.com, and listen all day right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT, where it's now 5:41. We've got an update this morning on a lawsuit that Mark Robinson has brought forward over unpaid campaign bills. The former lieutenant governor responded Thursday to a lawsuit filed against his gubernatorial campaign committee during the closing days of the 2024 election. Political consulting firm Vox Insights accused Robinson's campaign of failing to pay a $114,000 bill. Robinson's attorneys wrote in a 10-page document on Thursday, the plaintiff's claims should be barred to the extent it's committed a prior breach of contract by not providing for the contracted services. For its second affirmative defense, defendant states that the plaintiff's claims should be barred on the extent that suit upon contract was not executed by someone with the proper authority acting on behalf of the defendant. That would be Robinson. The plaintiff, the Vox Insights company, has actually acknowledged or should have known that the contract was not executed by someone with the proper authority. Vox filed its suit back on October the 28th, 8 days before voters chose Democrat Josh Stein over Robinson handedly to serve as the North Carolina governor. Vox's suit arrived as Robinson already faced a high-profile legal battle with CNN over an article that the television network published back in September, and the Vox firm provided polling data and related political information to election candidates and committees. The lawsuit alleges that Vox entered into a contract with the Friends of Mark Robinson Committee, Robinson's main group, on September the 13th, an agreement to provide polling results in exchange for compensation. An individual by the name of Conrad, who was a general consultant for Robinson, executed the contract on the committee's behalf while he was in North Carolina, the lawsuit alleged. However, it was also claimed that he stepped down as Robinson's campaign manager when Robinson refused to withdraw from the election over this CNN article. The lawsuit says, quote, on or about September the 18th, an invoice was sent from the Friends of Mark Robinson for $114,000 for services performed pursuant to the contract. The payment was required within 30 days. Vox claims damages of more than $25,000, and it also has sought an injunction and temporary restraining order to ensure that Robinson's campaign kept sufficient money in their bank to pay its debt. Robinson's legal battle with CNN does currently sit in federal court. The former lieutenant governor filed a court document in December opposing the cable network's motion to have the lawsuit dismissed. Robinson also seeks to have the case returned to state court where it was originally filed. So still some ongoing legal challenges for now the former lieutenant governor and Mark Robinson. Obviously, it's not as tight of a time frame as the Supreme Court race and some other legal challenges that we've talked about. However, we will keep a close eye on it and pass additional details along to you as soon as we get them right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:45, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at roadways on this Monday morning. We'll get an update with Dave Hewitt.
We've got some wet streets out there. Hot.
It's 5:51. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour, tap that subscribe and follow button, and take the show with you on demand on your own time. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Well, expecting a busy week in North Carolina politics. It will be the General Assembly that is back on Wednesday, where new members of the House and Senate will be sworn in, and the long 2025 long session of the General Assembly will begin. But before we can even get to that, there are still questions about a very high-stakes race in North Carolina surrounding the Supreme Court. And we've got an update this morning that came out late in the day on Friday around 6 p.m. That's when Republican State Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin filed a motion asking for a federal judge to send his legal dispute with the North Carolina State Board of Elections back to state court. With that, Griffin is also seeking an additional injunction blocking the election board from certifying the results of the November the 5th Supreme Court election. Without court action in the next couple of days, the election board is likely to certify appointed incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs as the election winner coming up this Friday, January the 10th. Riggs does lead Griffin statewide by 734 votes out of 5.5 million ballots cast in the contest. Griffin is challenging more than 60,000 ballots in the race, and certification of the election, according to Griffin's legal team, would moot his legal challenge. That's why he is seeking that injunction. Griffin originally filed paperwork back on December the 18th asking North Carolina's highest court to address his dispute with the North Carolina State Board of Elections. However, the state board filed paperwork just one day later on the 19th to remove the case to U.S. District Judge Richard Myers' courtroom, and that's exactly what happened. Griffin's lawyers wrote in their most recent update on Friday, quote, "At bottom, the board's attempted removal threatens our system of federalism. This case primarily turns upon unsettled issues of state law, and states, not the federal government, have the primary responsibility to regulate elections for state officials. But the board has attempted to circumvent a decision by the state's highest court by injecting a slew of inapplicable federal defenses and meritless arguments about their application solely for the purpose of obtaining federal jurisdiction. If this court maintains jurisdiction here, that decision will only incentivize the board to repeat these tactics in the future." As U.S. District Judge Richard Myers considers whether to keep the case or maintain jurisdiction, Griffin also asked the judge on Friday to issue an injunction, which his legal team claims is warranted because they need to maintain the status quo until the appropriate court can decide the case on its merits. That is dealing with this January the 10th date here without anything from U.S. District Judge Richard Myers in terms of an injunction or some sort of stay. There is a very high probability, high likelihood that the North Carolina State Board of Elections certifies Allison Riggs as the winner on Friday, and at that point, all of these legal challenges from Griffin essentially fall by the wayside. Myers did set a Friday deadline for Griffin to reply to arguments that were put forward last Wednesday by the election board by Riggs and various activist groups working with Democrat operative Mark Elias's law firm. The judge specifically ordered a state election officials to show cause as to why the case should not be returned to North Carolina's Supreme Court. And Griffin, I'll note, is a Court of Appeals judge, and he is the petitioner in that case. The election board lawyers wrote on Wednesday, "In this lawsuit, the petitioner, that being Griffin, makes an astonishing request to change long-standing election rules after an election has already taken place, and by doing so disenfranchise more than 60,000 voters who followed the rules in place at the time of the election. This requested relief confers jurisdiction on the court several times over." So we will be keeping a close eye on Judge Richard Myers' courtroom this week in terms of any additional updates from him. Everybody has now responded in the case. Riggs, the North Carolina Democrat Party, various activist groups, Griffin, everybody had responded as they were requested to last week. And now it will be up to Judge Richard Myers to determine whether to issue any sort of temporary injunction or stay. We will be tracking that throughout the week as it unfolds. Again, and the other thing that we're going to be tracking this week is the North Carolina General Assembly. Members of the House and the Senate are expected to be back in Raleigh around noon on Wednesday. That's when both the House and the Senate will convene, and new members of the General Assembly will be sworn in as they will begin the process of their lengthy legislative session, budgets, dealing with a brand new governor, a busy couple of months coming up here in North Carolina politics. That's going to do it for a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.